By the time anyone noticed them, it was already assumed they were finished, surrounded, exhausted, and nearly erased from memory. This army no longer existed in the calculations of kings or commanders. Supplies were gone, reinforcements were not coming, and the enemy, 40,000 strong, was closing in with absolute confidence. There was almost no hope left. History often remembers victories because they were loud, decisive, and impossible to ignore. This story is different. This army was forgotten before the battle even began, written off as a lost cause, left behind by allies who believed survival was no longer worth the cost. In the eyes of the world, their fate was already sealed. The numbers alone told a brutal story. 40,000 enemies meant overwhelming force, endless reserves, and total control. Against them stood a force worn down by time, hunger, and isolation. They had no advantage of scale, no promise of rescue, no illusion that strength alone could save them. What they had was far less visible and far more dangerous. What makes this story unsettling is not just that they fought. Many armies fight when defeat is certain. What shocks history is that they endured long enough for something unexpected to happen. Not a miracle, not a sudden arrival of reinforcements, but a shift, slow, fragile, and almost invisible at first. In those final moments before the enemy closed in, survival was no longer the goal. Meaning was to stand when no one expected it, to resist when surrender seemed logical, to refuse disappearance. This was not about glory or conquest. It was about not vanishing quietly. The enemy believed the battle would be brief, a formality, another number added to a growing list of victories. They underestimated what desperation can produce when nothing else remains. When hope is stripped down to its last fragments, fear changes shape. It no longer paralyzes, it focuses.
This is the story of how an army the world had abandoned faced 40,000 enemies with almost no hope left and refused to disappear. To understand how that refusal turned into something history still struggles to explain, we must step back into the world that left them behind. This abandonment changed everything. Morale eroded, not because the soldiers lacked courage, but because uncertainty is corrosive. Hunger grew, equipment wore down, injuries went untreated. Each day without support reinforced the same message: you are alone. The army did not just face an enemy, it faced the realization that it no longer mattered to anyone beyond its own ranks. Some questioned why they should continue. Surrender promised survival, even if it meant erasure. Retreat was impossible. To stay was to accept a slow, grinding end. These were not dramatic choices. They were quiet, exhausting ones, made under constant pressure. And yet, something held them together. That something was not loyalty to distant rulers. It was loyalty to one another. When the world withdraws its support, meaning collapses inward. Survival becomes personal. Every man understood that whatever happened next would be faced together or not at all. That shared understanding replaced external motivation. Ironically, abandonment also brought clarity. There were no more illusions of rescue, no strategies built around help that would never come. Decisions could be made without waiting for permission. This army no longer fought for territory or recognition. It fought because it existed, because disappearing without resistance felt worse than the risk of annihilation. The enemy sensed this isolation and interpreted it as weakness. They believed hunger and exhaustion would finish what abandonment had begun. And in many cases, they would have been right. Most forces collapse long before reaching this point. Most surrender quietly once hope is stripped away. But abandonment can produce something dangerous. When nothing is expected of you, failure loses its power. Fear changes. It stops asking what happens if you lose, because loss is already assumed. What remains is choice.
As the enemy closed in, the world's absence became undeniable. No banners appeared on the horizon. No messengers arrived with promises. The silence confirmed what everyone already knew. They were alone. And in that isolation, the conditions for an impossible outcome began to form. The enemy did not approach this battle with caution. They approached it with certainty. 40,000 soldiers represented more than numerical superiority. They represented inevitability. To them, this was not a test of strategy or endurance. It was the final step in a process that had already played out countless times before. A forgotten army, isolated and weakened, was simply the next obstacle to be erased. This force had everything the abandoned army lacked: fresh troops, reliable supply lines, confidence built on recent victories. Their ranks were deep enough to absorb losses without slowing momentum. If the front line fell, another replaced it instantly. Time worked in their favor. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear were weapons they did not have to wield actively. They only had to wait. Commanders believed the outcome was fixed. Plans focused not on survival, but on efficiency. How quickly the resistance could be crushed. How many units would be needed to finish the job. There was no urgency, only expectation. When an enemy has already been written off, preparation becomes mechanical rather than adaptive. The soldiers shared this belief. Many had marched through other territories where resistance collapsed almost immediately. Villages surrendered, fortifications fell, smaller forces scattered or laid down their weapons. The pattern was familiar. Numbers pressed forward, opposition dissolved.
victory followed. This was how war worked, until it didn't.
Psychology, the advantage was enormous. Fear usually travels ahead of armies this size. It clears roads and opens gates. In this case, it arrived to find no one left to intimidate. The forgotten army did not flee because it could not. It did not surrender because surrender meant disappearance. That refusal unsettled the enemy more than they realized. Still, confidence remained intact. The enemy believed resistance was only delaying the inevitable. Hunger would weaken resolve. Exhaustion would fracture discipline. When the battle began, pressure alone would finish what isolation had started. There was no reason to assume otherwise. What they failed to consider was what abandonment does to motivation. The forgotten army no longer fought to win approval or secure alliances. It fought because there was nothing left to lose. That mindset is difficult to break. Fear loses its leverage when defeat is already expected. The enemy force underestimated this completely. They saw worn armor and thin ranks and assumed weakness. They did not see the clarity that comes when survival is no longer negotiated. They did not understand that desperation can sharpen focus rather than dull it. As the 40,000 took their positions, banners flying and ranks forming with ease, the battlefield felt decided. Observers would have seen a simple equation: a massive force facing an army already abandoned by the world. History suggested only one possible ending. And that belief, shared by commanders, soldiers, and distant powers alike, became the enemy's greatest vulnerability. Because when victory feels guaranteed, vigilance fades. And when vigilance fades, the smallest refusal can grow into something far more dangerous than expected. The battle had not yet begun, but certainty already had something to lose. The forgotten army.
They were not forgotten because they lacked courage. They were forgotten because they no longer fit the story anyone wanted to tell. Once this army had mattered. It had held territory, enforced borders, and served a purpose within a larger strategy. But war moves quickly, and usefulness is temporary. When circumstances changed, so did attention. And when attention vanished, so did support. The soldiers who remained were worn down by more than combat. Hunger weakened bodies already strained by months of fighting. Armor was damaged and rarely replaced. Weapons were repaired again and again until nothing but skill kept them functional. Wounds that should have been treated were endured instead. Survival became a daily act of improvisation. Morale did not collapse all at once. It eroded slowly through silence. No new orders, no reinforcements, no acknowledgement that they were still holding. Each unanswered message reinforced the same truth. Whatever happened next would be faced alone. For many, that realization was heavier than fear. Yet something held this army together. Not loyalty to distant leaders who had already moved on, but loyalty to the men standing beside them. When the world shrinks, bonds tighten. Each soldier understood that survival depended on cohesion. If one broke, others would follow. If one held, others would find the strength to do the same. There was no illusion of victory. That fantasy had already died. What remained was clarity. They knew the enemy was stronger. They knew the odds were against them. And because of that, decisions became simpler. There was no reason to conserve energy for a future that might not exist. Every action mattered now.
Leadership adapted to this reality. Commanders stopped thinking in terms of grand objectives and focused on survival through control. Where to stand, when to move, how to deny the enemy easy progress. Orders were stripped of optimism and reduced to necessity. That honesty preserved trust when nothing else could. The forgotten army also understood terrain in a way their enemy did not. Months of isolation had forced them to live with the land. They knew where movement slowed, where visibility failed, where numbers lost their advantage. What had once been a disadvantage, being stuck, became familiarity. Familiarity became leverage. Psychologically, abandonment changed everything. Fear usually asks one question: what happens if I lose? For these soldiers, the answer was already known. Loss meant disappearance. That certainty stripped fear of its power. What replaced it was resolve, not loud or dramatic, but unyielding. They did not believe they would be remembered. They did not expect reward. They fought because disappearing without resistance felt worse than death itself. That belief is difficult to break. It does not rely on hope. It survives without it. As the enemy prepared to strike, the forgotten army stood where it had been left, thin, exhausted, and underestimated. From the outside, they looked like a force waiting to be erased. From the inside, they were already decided. They would not vanish quietly. And in that refusal, the impossible began to take shape. Section 5. The night before everything ended. Night fell without ceremony. There were no celebrations, no songs, no speeches meant to inspire courage. Only the quiet movements of men who believed this might be their last evening alive. Fires were kept low, not out of strategy, but habit. Supplies were too scarce to waste. Every decision now carried weight.
Hunger was constant, not sharp anymore, but dull and exhausting, the kind that drains strength slowly rather than demanding attention. Rations were shared without discussion. No one complained. Complaints require hope that something might change. Here there was only acceptance. Bodies were weak, but minds were clear. Some soldiers sat together, speaking softly about ordinary things, not about the battle, not about fear. They spoke of places they had come from, people they might never see again, moments that felt distant now. These conversations were not meant to comfort. They were meant to remember, to prove that they had existed before this moment tried to erase them. Others stayed silent, staring into the darkness beyond the camp. The enemy fires were visible in the distance, countless points of light spreading across the land. 40,000 reminders that morning would bring violence on a scale they could barely imagine. The sight should have crushed morale. Instead, it hardened it. When the worst is already visible, there is nothing left to fear from surprise. Commanders moved quietly through the ranks, checking positions, speaking in low voices. There were no promises of victory, no attempt to manufacture belief. Orders were practical. Hold here. Watch this approach. Move only when necessary. Leadership now was not about inspiration. It was about stability. Sleep came in fragments. Some men closed their eyes, knowing they might not open them again. Others stayed awake, conserving awareness rather than strength. Every sound carried farther in the dark. Every movement felt deliberate. The world seemed to pause, as if waiting. What little hope remained was not tied to survival. It was tied to meaning. If this was the end, it would not be quiet. It would not be empty. They would be seen, even if only by the enemy standing before them. That belief mattered more than comfort.
As dawn approached, the air grew colder. The silence deepened. Men rose slowly, adjusting armor that no longer fit quite right. Weapons were lifted, tested, and gripped tightly. There was no final signal to mark the end of waiting. The night did not end with rest. It ended with resolve.
and when the first light touched the battlefield, the forgotten army was still there, thin, exhausted, and ready to face whatever came next. The battle did not begin with a roar. It began with movement. As the first enemy units advanced, the ground seemed to tremble under the weight of 40,000 boots. From the forgotten army's position, the enemy appeared endless. Ranks forming, reforming, expanding far beyond what the eye could track. This was not an attack meant to test defenses. It was meant to erase them. The initial clash was brutal and immediate. The enemy pushed forward with confidence, expecting resistance to fold under pressure. Instead, they met a line that did not retreat. The forgotten army absorbed the impact, formations tightening as bodies collided. The sound was overwhelming. Metal on metal, shields splintering, men shouting and falling. But within that chaos, something unexpected happened. Control held. Space vanished quickly. The battlefield narrowed into pockets of violence, where numbers lost their advantage. Enemy soldiers pushed from behind, forcing their own front lines into cramped positions. Movements became restricted. Coordination suffered. What was meant to be an overwhelming surge turned into compression, and compression turned into confusion.
As the fighting intensified, the enemy adapted by sheer force. More units were fed into the battle. Arrows darkened the sky in relentless volleys. Shields rose where they could. Some arrows struck true. Men fell silently, pulled back or trampled as the line closed around them. Loss was constant, but collapse did not come. Time became distorted. Minutes stretched into something unrecognizable. The sun climbed higher, and the battlefield grew hotter, heavier, louder. Blood soaked the ground, making footing uncertain. Every step required attention. Every breath felt earned. The forgotten army rotated fighters when possible, pulling the weakest back and pushing others forward. These moments were dangerous, but they preserved cohesion. For the enemy, frustration began to replace certainty. This was not how the battle was supposed to unfold. Resistance should have ended quickly. Instead, progress was slow and costly. Orders grew louder, less precise. Units attacked without coordination, driven by urgency rather than strategy. Confidence began to fracture. Bodies piled where the fighting was thickest. Movement slowed further as soldiers stumbled over the fallen. The weight of numbers became a liability. Momentum died not because the enemy lacked men, but because it lacked control. The forgotten army exploited this instinctively, holding ground where pressure was greatest and denying space wherever possible. By the time the enemy paused to regroup, something irreversible had happened. The forgotten army still stood, reduced, bloodied, and pushed to the edge, but standing. The impossible had not yet become victory, but inevitability was gone. The battle had crossed a line. It was no longer about numbers or plans. It had become a contest of endurance and resolve. And in that contest, the army that had been abandoned by the world had found something it did not know it still possessed. The belief that it could choose how this would end. And that belief was about to change everything. Section 7. How hope returned when it shouldn't have. Hope did not return all at once. It did not arrive as a surge of confidence or a sudden belief in victory. It crept back quietly, almost unnoticed, through small moments that began to contradict expectation. The enemy slowed. Attacks lost coordination. Pressure eased just enough to breathe. These were not signs of triumph, but they were signs that the forgotten army had not yet been erased. The first shift came through terrain.
What had once seemed like a trap became an advantage. Narrow approaches limited how many enemy soldiers could fight at once. Uneven ground disrupted formations. Familiar paths allowed the forgotten army to reposition with precision, while the enemy struggled to adapt. The land itself began to resist the weight placed upon it. Discipline amplified this advantage. The forgotten army no longer fought to win ground, it fought to deny it. Shields locked, lines tightened, movement became minimal and efficient. Every step forward by the enemy was made costly, every pause was exploited. Where the enemy relied on momentum, the defenders relied on control.
Psychology began to shift as well. The enemy had expected fear, collapse, and surrender. Instead, they found silence. No victory cries, no visible panic. Each failed push planted doubt. Doubt slowed action. Slower action created hesitation. Hesitation spread. The larger force began to fight itself as much as its opponent. Leadership played a crucial role in this transformation. Commanders recognized the change immediately and reinforced it. Orders remained simple and grounded. Hold here. Do not pursue. Rotate when possible. There was no attempt to inspire heroics. Survival required restraint, not bravado. That clarity preserved cohesion when exhaustion threatened to tear it apart. Rotation became essential. Exhausted soldiers were pulled back just before discipline failed. Others stepped forward, not stronger, but still capable of holding. These exchanges were brief and dangerous, yet they prevented collapse. The enemy, confident in numbers, did not rotate with the same care. Fatigue spread through its front lines unchecked. As hours passed, something unexpected emerged within the forgotten army. Belief, not in victory, but in possibility. The certainty of defeat began to crack. If they could hold this long, perhaps they could hold longer. If the enemy could be slowed, perhaps it could be stopped. These thoughts were fragile, but powerful. For the enemy, the opposite occurred. What should have been an easy conclusion became a question. Why was resistance still standing? Why were losses mounting without progress? Confidence began to drain away, replaced by frustration and anger. Those emotions fueled reckless assaults that only increased casualties. Hope returned not as optimism, but as resolve. The forgotten army did not imagine triumph, it imagined endurance. And endurance, sustained long enough, began to reshape the battlefield. Every moment held reduced the enemy's advantage. Every refusal weakened certainty.
By the time the sun reached its highest point, the balance had shifted in a way no one had predicted. The forgotten army was still there, still organized, still denying collapse, and the enemy, vast, powerful, and confident, was no longer certain of the outcome. Hope had returned where it should not have existed at all. Not because conditions improved, but because expectations failed. Section 8. The moment of near collapse. Every battle has a point where endurance is tested beyond preparation. For the forgotten army, that point arrived suddenly and without mercy. Hours of sustained fighting had drained what little strength remained. Arms felt heavy, vision blurred, reactions slowed just enough for danger to slip through. Discipline, once instinctive, now required conscious effort. The enemy sensed it. Pressure increased sharply as fresh units were thrown forward. Attacks came faster, harder, and with less regard for losses. This was no longer a controlled advance. It was an attempt to crush resistance through sheer force. The forgotten army's line bent under the impact, narrowing dangerously as exhausted soldiers struggled to hold position. For a brief and terrifying stretch of time, collapse felt inevitable. Gaps opened where bodies fell.
Commands were lost in the noise. The fighting became brutally close, reduced to instinct and muscle memory. Men fought face to face, sometimes without space to swing a weapon. The ground disappeared beneath blood and broken bodies. Fear returned, not as panic, but as urgency. One failure here would cascade instantly. Everyone knew it. There would be no recovery if the line broke. The enemy's numbers would pour through, and the battle would end in moments. This awareness sharpened focus rather than shattering it.
The forgotten army reacted the only way it could. It tightened inward. Space was sacrificed for stability. Movements shortened. Shields overlapped more closely. Where strength was gone, structure remained. Soldiers leaned into one another, holding the line together when individual endurance failed. At the same time, chaos undermined the enemy. Their urgency destroyed coordination. Units collided with each other. Orders contradicted. Momentum became pressure without direction. Numbers pressed forward blindly, turning advantage into obstruction. The battlefield became too crowded to fight effectively. Then, almost imperceptibly, the pressure changed. Attacks slowed, not because the enemy lacked soldiers, but because it lacked clarity. Losses were mounting. Progress was minimal. What was meant to be a final push had become an uncontrolled slaughter. Hesitation appeared where certainty once ruled. The forgotten army felt it immediately. The crushing weight against them eased just enough to breathe, just enough to stabilize. Collapse had been inches away. Survival had returned by the narrowest margin possible. This was the turning point, not marked by victory cries or dramatic maneuvers, but by restraint. The enemy no longer believed this battle would end quickly, and when belief falters, power weakens. The forgotten army had not won, but it had refused to fall, and that refusal changed everything. Section 9. Victory no one expected. When the fighting finally slowed, it did not feel like victory. It felt like disbelief. The battlefield fell into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the sounds of the wounded and the shifting of exhausted men. The forgotten army was still standing, not whole, not unbroken, but alive, and the enemy force of 40,000 was no longer advancing. For the forgotten army, the realization came slowly. At first, they simply held their positions, waiting for the next assault. Then minutes passed, then more. The pressure did not return. Only then did it sink in. They had endured long enough to change the outcome, not through dominance, but through survival. The enemy's withdrawal sent shock through both sides. Soldiers who had expected an easy conclusion struggled to understand why they were falling back. Confidence drained away, replaced by confusion and frustration. Orders were given, but momentum was gone. The certainty that had driven the advance was broken. Among the forgotten army, there was no celebration. Too many had fallen, too much had been lost. Victory, if it could be called that, felt heavy. But it was undeniable. Against all logic, against every assumption, they had held. And by holding, they had forced an enemy with overwhelming numbers to reconsider its advance. News of what had happened spread quickly. Observers struggled to believe it. An army written off by allies, abandoned by the world, had stood against 40,000 and survived. Not only survived, but forced a pause, forced hesitation, forced respect. This was not the kind of victory that reshapes borders overnight. It was the kind that reshapes belief.
It proved that inevitability can be challenged, that abandonment does not always lead to erasure, that even forgotten forces can still decide how history unfolds.
As the enemy withdrew from the field, the forgotten army remained where it had been left, reduced in number, scarred beyond repair, but unbroken. They had not conquered. They had not been saved. They had done something far more unsettling. They had won without permission. Section 10. Why this army was forgotten.
The forgotten army did not need history's approval to matter. Their survival reshaped the battle in front of them in the minds of those who witnessed it. That impact was real, even if it went unrecorded. This is why their story matters now, because forgotten does not mean insignificant. Sometimes it means uncomfortable. Sometimes it means inconvenient. And sometimes it means powerful enough to be ignored. They were abandoned. They were outnumbered. They were nearly erased. And still they stood.